Okay. Hello. Chapter 10. We want to see the world. And by the way, it's still the same book. I was a little awed at my new estate, Laura said, of the farm, home where she lived with Manly. After their wedding, the Wilder had began. A mile straight north of Day Smith. Instead of the usual quarter section of 160 acres of homestead land, Manly had filed on 2 quarter sections. The second one was a tree claim further north. The government allowed settlers simulations. Second claims as they planted 10 acres of the land with young trees. On Manly's tree claimed the required acres of cottonwoods, elms, and box elders were thriving when the building of the Wilders. First house was complete. One day the trees were shaded and cool little house. Laura was pleased with their home with her husband. Had built. It was a neat little frame house. Painted soft gray windows in the living room, bedroom, and kitchen, let in the sunlight and views of the green prairie and the blue sky overhead. Laura quickly felt at home and was delighted when she discovered a wonderful cabinet in her pantry. Monzo had made himself drawers and cupboards. Did to provide. Laura was space every need as a married woman. Laura knew that would not have to manage her housekeeping as skillfully as Ma always had. Under the wedding, Manly decided to put more of his hand into the convolution immediately. With other 300 acres, he could raise bountiful crops. He and Laura discussed plans for the farm together. Manly used Laura's ideas. They decided to approach wheat farming on the prairie as a team. Laura quickly found that her contribution was near a manager. When she sent eggs to the town with Manly to trade, they bought just 5 cents a dozen, and no one wanted her butter at any price. It took money and quite some amount to get started on the farm there. I tell I'm sorry about the young. At that, Laura remembered when she brought over the first years of the Wilder spent on Dakota farm. There was expensive military to buy. Horses were needed to power the field of machines, and horses need plenty of feed as well as shelter. I just can't. Sorry. Okay. Shelter and horses needed plenty of feed. Okay. Sometimes men had to hire to help Manly, especially at the harvest time. Though they disliked it, the Wilders steps mounted Even the little gray house was mortgaged for $500 to save the cost of a paying hireman, where I often helped Manly with the farm work. I wanted to do all kinds of this at the farm work with Manarchy, she said. I've heard the binder driven 6 horses for their work. Work was hard. Manly and Aurora believed their acres of rich prairie had landed with one they produced for them lavishly. They had hope and patience in the farmer, and they believed that the next year would be better than the one before. When their work was done, and all on Sundays, Manly and Nora had happy times. They visited their friends, and Dave Smith or their friends drove out to see the Tree Queen for the meals and conversations. They attended concerts and church socials in town, and often visit Pa and Ma, and the girls on the homestead. One of Laura's favorite memories of her early marriage life was the horseback riders she and Manly shared. In their stable were 2 swift ponies, Trixie and Fly. Sometimes before breakfast, Manly and Laura would saddle their horses and ride off across the prairie. Laura were to imitate a cowboy yell that set her Trixie off like a streak. Aunt and Laura had to stop her horse while Manly and Fly caught up to them. The Wilders started their usual long buggy rides together. During the spring of 1886, on Sunday afternoons, they rode far over the green prairies. June was always Laura's favorite month on the prairie because it was time when the wild roses bloom. The little bushes of pink and red blossoms colored the land, and the sweet scent of flowers filled the warm air. Laura and Manly were expecting their first child, and the rose covered the land suggested a name to Laura. Sorry. Pardon me. As they wondered about names for their baby, Amelia pointed out they need to wait and see if it's a boy or a girl was born. Laura abruptly settled the name matter. It'll be a girl, and we'll call her Rose, she said. That summer of 1886 was a bumper season for more than wild roses. Cross grew lush and promising. Mary said he's never seen such a wheat. Laura estimated their wheat crop would bring $3,000. They could not pay their taxes, pay for the house, pay for the farm, and still be rich. One hot August day, just before Manly planted to harvest the wheat, the sky darkened and great sleets fell, patting the land from their house. The Wilders watched breezily as the storm increased. When it was over, they realized that their crop was gone. The grain was pounded into the wet ground. The wheat field was ruined. With their baby due in December and expensive money, Laura and Manly knew that they had recognized their plans. They found that they could mortgage their homestead land to raise money to pay some of their bills, but the bank required that they live in the homestead land, which was a short distance from the tree claim. They approved the shutting and the homestead land on their first wedding anniversary. They closed the little gray house and moved. The shanty stood on the top of a long, sloping hill. From its top, Laura could see Dave Smith to the south of the Winston Hills, to the west Spirit Lake, to the north of Silver Lake, to the east Manly improved the homestead during the fall and made plans for the next year's crop. Most Laura was quiet in her rocking chair waiting for the birth of her baby. Just as Laura had predicted, the baby was a girl. On one night of December 5th, 1886, Rose Wilder was born. She was a healthy, big baby. Ma stayed a few days to help, and then a hired girl came to work for Laura for a while. But for most of the winter, Manly, Laura, and Rose were alone in a cozy, isolated shady on the prairie. Laura and Manly's dreams of a strong crop in the 1887 did not come true because of the hot winds and dry weather. The crops were merged that summer. Some of the hay crop in the barn in the mistress fire. Laura worried and sometimes wondered if they should give up farming. But Manly was more patient, believed that they could be successful. Pa and Ma had a weird of trying to farm their homestead at Christmas time. In 1887, they moved to Dave Smith permanently. Pa built a comfortable little house for the family on the First Street, not far from the church and close to the school. Carrie and Grace attended. Pa still did not most of the culinary shops in town. He and Ma lived in Dave Smith for the rest of their lives and never moved again. Little Rose was quickly whisked to Pa's house. During the winter of 1888, Laura Manly contracted diphtheria, and in 4 weeks they lay sick while Rose was safe in town. Will Wilder nursed Laura and Manly as the best he could, but their recovery was slow. Manly was most seriously affected and partially paralyzed by the illness. When he could leave his sick bed, he moved painfully. His feet were particularly lame, and with great difficulty he shuffled and struggled to walk. Even when his hands were affected, had been a vigorous 30-year-old man before the sickness came, and after he left, he worked constantly to regain his strength and his ability to run the farm. Although Laura left her own work in the house, helping Manly with some task his clumsy fingers could no longer do. He could drive the team with a plow, but he could no longer hitch the horses. The 302 acres of land were too much for Manly to the farm. A buyer purchased the homestead quarter, and the Wilders moved back to the tree claim and a little gray house with the weather conditions so uncertain and the outcome of their crops so unpredictable. When I Manly talk of raising sheep on the farm, Laura's cousin Peter Ingalls had moved to Dave Smith. He offered to be the Wilder's partner, so together they bought 100 shows for sheep. Peter lived with the Wilders and was a great help to Manly, who was still weak. The growing season in 1889 was a dry one. Lonely, Laura and Manly looked up at the sky, hoping to see the signs of rain. The tree claim planting struggled to survive along the garden and the field crops for the weeks. The winds were so hot that they burned the wheat and oat crops until they died. How I wish it could rain. Laura's sister Grace murmured in her diary, and Laura spoke of how heartbreaking it was to watch the grain we had sown such a withered and yellow. And the hot winds Although the weather had destroyed the crops, the Wilders still had something to look forward to. They expected a new baby in August. The baby was born on a hot afternoon, a boy. He looked just like Manly. Gracie was the third, but he did not live on August 10th. Dave Smith's newspaper reported that Mr. and Mrs. A.J. Wilder's little child died on Wednesday evening. The Wilder's baby boy was buried in a marked grave in Dave Smith Cemetery. He had no name. Laura's feelings were so noble and sorrowful that she was hardly wanted anyone to mention that her son to her. Rose was too young to remember her brother, but she didn't know that my mother wanted nothing about it. I think she never stopped grieving, and it was her way to be silent about any unhappy subject. Laura felt that only wanted the rest of the baby staff. Rose was nearly free and could help with some simple chores, including feeding the stove with hay sticks. One afternoon, Rose was fueling the stove when the hay and hearth caught fire. She dropped the burning hay, and almost immediately the kitchen was ablaze. Laura could only scramble with one burning house with Rose. She was too weak to fight the fire by the time the neighbors saw the flames and immediately rushed in from the fields. The house was burning unconscionably. Only a few things were saved. Whereas wedding silver and some clothes and dishes. But both of the farming venture in the happy little house where the Wilders had started their married life were in ruins. Manly hastily contributed a shanty for the family to live near the fire-watt hole where the house had been, but he and Laura were planning to leave Dakota. Manly had never recovered his health, and with the beginning of another drought season, he could see the little hope in continuing farming. His father's from in Minnesota was flourishing, and extra help was always needed there. So Manly and Laura decided to make a long visit to Spring Valley in the spring of 1890. The Wilder sheep was sold for $500. The money went half to the Wilders and half to the Peter Ingalls. Narrated a covered wagon for the trip east. Laura and Manly packed their few precious and told Rose all about Minnesota, where they were going. Over and over while her parents packed Rose. Repeated the symbols. Minnesota. The Wilders said goodbye to Laura's family as Pa's family had done in Walnut Grove. The Wilders were back trailing to the east, where they hoped to find life easier. Laura rode her pony Pearl away on the trip across the eastern South Dakota and Minnesota. Laura, Manly, and Rose were welcomed kindly into the Big Wilders farmhouse in the Spring Valley. Laura grew to love Manly's father and mother, who did all they could to make things comfortable for their guests. Rose became a great favorite among the Wilders' relatives and friends. Manly, Laura, and Rose spent over a year with the Wilders. The notion suggested that Manly should try a warmer, milder climate to improve his poor health. Laura's cousin Peter had settled in Florida. Following a trip he had made down to Mississippi, Peter had married married a servant girl and lived in Florida Panhandle, near a village called Westville. He wrote to the Wilder's, praising the warm weather, the pine forests, and opportunities of Florida. Homesteading Manly and Nora decided to follow Peter to Florida. Manly caught it of his horses, livestock, and manling positions in Spring Valley, and in the fall of 1891, the Wilders were ready to travel again. They decided to journey by the train, which would be Rose's first experience on the railroad. Well supplies of boxes of food and pantry, parting presents for the Wilders' relatives were Manly and Rose boarded to the train for the South. Neither Laura nor Manly had ever seen a place. Yep. Like Florida. Backwoods gray, moss dripping off the trees, and scrubby pines grew up from the red, tinted earth. Were described it was a land where the trees always murmured, where the butterflies are enormous, where the plants that eat insects grow in the moist plants, and alligators inhabit the slowly moving water of the rivers. But a Yankee woman was more precarious than any of these. When the Wilders saw the neighborhood viewed with suspicion, Laura was seen as a haughty up north Gaul, and even Cousin Peter's wife disliked her. Laura kept Rose particularly close to her at all times. She concealed a revolver in her skirt pocket for safety. Perhaps Manly worked in lumbering camps near Westville, or perhaps he simply rested and tried again to regain his strength. The severe climate made Laura ill. The dampness and the heat drained her and made her long for high-level prairies. After less than a year in Florida, the Wilders decided to go home. They knew that South Dakota was still in a drought cycle, but the homestead land was still there. And friends and family, in August of 1892, they packed their belongings and boarded the train for home. Manly, Laura, and Rose were welcome at the Ingalls home. They visited there a while before they moved into a house. A block away, Manly worked when he could, doing carpentry or painting, clearing his brother's royal store. Pa also had a store called the Ingalls and Company, and sometimes needed help when he drove his powder's wagon into the countryside to sell to farmers. Laura found work at the dressmakers for $1 a day. While her parents worked, Rose spent the day at the Ingalls home. She sat with Ma and Mary in the parlor to knit, and sew and drink yerba tea. She was 5 then. She was 5 when she admitted to the D. Smith School. Surprised everyone with her talent, enthusiasm for reading and writing. The water stream of weeds farming was finished. Manly and Nora taught and blended. They needed to find a climate where intense could not plague Manly's crippled feet. They needed to farm on a small scale. They heard of land developments in Ozark Mountains of southern Missouri. Land companies circled glossy pictures of orchids, fat cattle, tree-covered hills, and rushing streams. Missouri seemed to be a land of promise. A neighbor from D. Smith went to Ozark looking things over. He bought a Missouri apple and gave it to her. It was the biggest reddest apple she has ever seen. That apple decided where the Wilders family would settle next. When their friends heard that the Wilders were moving again, they wondered and worried that the drought would end sometime. To guess why did the Wilders travel so much? An old school friend of Laura's came to see her. She asked why Laura and Manly were going to Missouri. Laura did not explain all the reasons. She could not bear to tell again all the hardships she and Manly had endured since their marriage. All could answer was, we want to see the world. Okay. I'm gonna take a break before we get to 11.